On June 17, my regular vacation ended and I arrived in Russia, where, as it turned out, a whole bunch of problems awaited me. The Russians came to the outskirts of the city and set up their artillery there. We knew that they now had an advantage in taking the city. I looked for my battalion and couldn't find it. Then I went to a guard on the railroad and asked him where my division had gone. I knew that my unit was taking up positions north of Slaviansk, and I had orders to go there. I set out on foot. I came out on the main highway that led from Slaviansk to Kharkov. On the way, I came across a new cemetery for German soldiers. I stopped and thought that during my absence, many of my comrades had managed to lie in this land forever. I soon got on the line of communication, and after another hour and a half of travel, I found my division. There I was instructed where to look for my battalion. At 10 p.m., the cooks finally succeeded in getting food to the company, which was impossible to do under fire during the day. I carried my portion to my tent and began to settle in. As I ate, I looked around. Many new faces appeared, including an entire company manned by the Turkic peoples of Russia. They were Vlasov's soldiers, and these ones could be recognized immediately by their slanted eyes. Their appearance evoked pity. They were probably the weakest unit of soldiers that had ever fought in the German army. Although I had unpacked some of my belongings, I doubted I would be able to get comfortable. The enemy was too close. Anything could happen. We were all wondering what was in store for us in the next few days. And then the Russian artillery fire put us in a different mood. Our position was on the edge of the forest. The enemy had taken cover behind a flat piece of terrain only 200 meters away from us. This Russian fire was not continuous, but they conducted it both day and night. Our enemy was not going to rest for as far as we knew of his objectives. He intended to capture the city of Slaviansk by June 25. We had a feeling that we would not be able to stop the Russians, as we were well aware of the weakness of our forces in this section. But we managed to hold Slaviansk even after June 25, and we were comforted by the fact that we managed to disrupt the enemy's plans to some extent. A month later, the city fell and was in the hands of the enemy, but it happened only because we fulfilled the planned withdrawal of our troops. The military leadership decided that our army should move back to the Dnieper River and regroup there. We began the withdrawal on June 25. The retreat was very slow. We began to destroy all important objects in the city. We blew up all railroad tracks leading to the city, blew up every railroad bridge, and destroyed the crossings across the river. In addition, the entire population was taken out of the city, all the people and all the livestock. Finally, the whole city was put to the fire. It was a terrible sight. As we left the town, we heard the cries of the inhabitants and saw the charred remains of the animals. We did this in every town, in every village on our way. As night fell, you could see for many kilometers into the distance the burning settlements that we left behind us at the end of our march through eastern Ukraine. It was a ghastly sight, and I did not enjoy it at all. The methodical withdrawal of the German army continued for many months. Wheat fields burned on our way, cattle burned. On September 27, we crossed the Dnieper and entered the city of Dnipropetrovsk. After the last division crossed the river, we blew up all the bridges. Along the bank of the Dnieper, we immediately equipped new positions. They were to be our winter quarters, but to our surprise, the Russians on the other bank were already looking us in the faces. We discovered that in the 20th of September, many of their units had already crossed the Dnieper. It became clear to all of us that our winter stay on the Dnieper would not take place, that we would have to winter somewhere closer to the Oder River in Silesia. We held our positions from September 27 to October 12. Then we left Dnipropetrovsk and traveled between Kryvyi Rog and Nikopol on the road to Odessa. We went from Dnipropetrovsk about 130 kilometers and stopped to assess the situation. Despite all the obstacles, we organized our enemy, including blowing up bridges, mining roads, and preparing ambushes. He was constantly stepping on our heels. We made a stop on the railroad tracks of the railroad station at Chezabudnov. We spent several days there, taking advantage of the pause in the enemy's pursuit of us, but we had to position ourselves openly along the railroad. On the other side of the tracks was a small village. We reconnoitered there and were convinced that the place might serve as a more convenient defensive position for us. Here we could take shelter, also from the weather. On October 20, we received orders to prepare to attack Brank. The town's defenses were weak, and the assault turned out to be quick and easy. Our new positions were much better than the old ones, on the railroad tracks in plain sight. The next day, I came down with a cold. On the doctor's recommendation, I decided to spend a few days in the stockade. On October 27, the battalion commander sent for me. He told me that things were falling apart, and after my recovery, he would really need me in his service. Having returned to the location of the unit, I immediately went to the commander. He inquired about my health, to which I replied that I was fine again. The commander brought me the news that the Russians were preparing a new offensive. He ordered me to go to the observation post and there listen carefully, as I understood Russian. I prepared for the assigned task, and by 1:30 a.m. on October 28, I was already at the observation post. The night was very dark. Dense clouds completely obscured the light of the moon and stars. At first, it was quite difficult for me to orient myself on the terrain, but after wandering around for a while, I began to get a pretty good idea of the area. I decided to head away from the town, and after passing 2 fields and traveling about 1.5 kilometers, I found myself very close to the front of the Russians. Their position was on the edge of a wheat field. I crept through the rows of dry wheat and settled down at a convenient vantage point from which the Russian positions were clearly visible. I was not alone. As I approached that spot, I saw my comrade from the 5th Company there. He also found our position convenient and positioned himself on it. It was so dark that if I had not called out to him, he would not have noticed me. I asked him twice where the 6th Company had deployed. He responded by simply nodding somewhere to the right. I understood the general direction, but at this point the fog was so dense that visibility was limited to only a couple of meters. The weather was strange. The fog did not stand still. It would drop to within half a meter of the ground and then rise again 2 meters up. At the front, everything was very calm, as it is in the calm before a storm. As my intended personal observation post was occupied, I continued to observe by patrolling, going in the direction of the German positions. At one point, the fog suddenly cleared, revealing a view that made me freeze in place. I saw the silhouettes of 2 men standing only about 30 meters away from me. I immediately realized that these were not our soldiers, that I was quite close to the enemies. I gave the conditional signal for the military police to head in my direction. Help was not slow to appear. As my comrades approached me, they were quickly spotted by Russian intelligence. I threw myself to the ground for cover and raised my weapon, a .98 carbine. As our patrol approached where I was, the soldiers did the same, and soon an active firefight broke out at the spot. After a minute or two of firing, I noticed blood running down my right arm. I was wounded, but not severely. I lay sprawled on the ground under some bushes for a few minutes, but my position was very vulnerable. If I stayed here, I would soon be a dead man. I prepared to make a dash for my hiding place. To my left, I heard the footsteps of our patrol. The patrol's attention was drawn to the gunfire, and I was relieved to think that help was on the way. I could not get out, for just as I raised my head, bullets whistled at my ears. For a while, it would be better for me to lie quietly and wait for the enemy to leave. The fog began to lift again. I looked at my watch. It showed 3 o'clock in the morning. About 20 meters away from me, I distinguished distinct clubs of black smoke. It looked like the Russians had pinned down more than just me alone. I decided that that spot would give me the best defense. There I could orient myself and determine where I was. I jumped out of my hiding place and ran as fast as I could. The Russians were firing at me, and I felt a few bullets whizzing past, but I kept running. When I got close enough to my new hiding place, I immediately dived headfirst into it. I was relieved to realize that I hadn't been hit and felt safe for a while. I sat up and looked around. It was dark, but I saw 6 pairs of eyes staring at me at once. I saw a mortar man too. One of the soldiers asked me in Russian, "Hey, are you all right?" My heart sank into my heels. I knew I wasn't all right at all. What have I done? I was wearing a black duffel coat that I had gotten many months before and a big Russian winter hat. The 6 soldiers in the shelter thought I was a Russian soldier, too. I guess I looked like them. I nodded slightly to the soldiers, but said nothing. I tried my best to hide my fear. I had to get out of there, and as soon as possible. I started climbing back up, out of the shelter. One of the soldiers inside noticed my boots, recognizing them as part of a German soldier's uniform. He grabbed my foot and pulled me back into the shelter with a shout. "It's a bloody crot." Soon I felt several hands grab me at once and pin me to the ground. The soldiers surrounded me, took away my weapon, and forced me to raise my arms. One of them pulled off my coat, made me turn around, and went through all my pockets. They took my wallet with all its contents and then tore off all my awards. The Iron Cross, a badge of distinction for participation in the attack, a Romanian medal, and a silver badge for a combat wound. The Russians scrutinized them, their faces glowing with pride at having captured a prisoner. Having admired their trophies enough, they dragged me out of hiding and led me to their company commander, who was only about 100 meters away. On my arrival at the Russian camp, my guard was entrusted to 3 sentries. The soldiers went through my pockets again and found a lighter, a mirror, and a comb. The commander came over and silently took the comb for himself. Then he took my soldier's book, which is given to every soldier and contains a detailed description of his career, data about his branch of service, and other valuable information. He thumbed through it, but could deduce nothing from its contents. He looked at me with a scrutinizing gaze. My appearance seemed to puzzle him. I thought it was because I did not wear epaulettes and insignia on my tunic. "Are you an officer?" he asked. "No, I'm a cook, a simple unit cook." I knew I could tell him anything, because I could see he didn't understand what my papers said. He took 2 steps in my direction and hit me in the face with my papers. Then he handed them back to me with the words, "Take this." Then the commander turned to my guards. "Take this crot back to the battalion, and be careful. I don't want him to escape." They answered with glee, "Yes, Commander." One of the escorts shoved his weapon into my back. "Hands behind your head." I obeyed obediently, trying not to make any sudden movements. The other soldier pushed me in the back, giving me the command to go forward. He himself kept behind me along with the first one who introduced me to his weapon. The third escort walked about 3 meters ahead of me, letting me know that I should follow him. The pre-dawn gloom and dense fog made it difficult for me to see him even at this close range. All along the way, a sense of unease lingered in my mind. I could not help thinking about my Zollbuch. It will be a valuable document for the enemy when it can be read. I must get rid of it, but how? As we walked along, those Russians who were escorting me from behind were talking animatedly among themselves. At this, they began to fall behind. Trying hard not to arouse suspicion, I fumbled for my papers and quietly took them out of my left pocket. Taking out the Zollbuch, I dropped it on the ground. Then I stepped on it and kicked it aside with my boots, trying to bury it in the dirt. Although it was almost impossible to see all this in the darkness and fog, the rustling attracted the attention of the Russians, and they immediately rushed toward me. One of them pounced on me and knocked me to the ground with a blow. Then he struck me several times briefly on the back with a flask. When he was satisfied with the results of such work, he, rising, shouted, "Get up, quickly, or I'll shoot you at once." I rose to my feet with a groan. "What were you doing?" The guard asked me, but I didn't answer. He hit me again with the buttstock, but not hard enough to knock me down. "Now go. If you do that again, you're a dead man. Understand?" I didn't say anything again. Even though my back hurt a lot, I managed to smile. What happened made the Russians abruptly cut the conversation short. Now their footsteps sounded much closer. As we walked through the wheat field, the night and fog suddenly receded. We arrived in the neighboring village, where the Russian battalion's CP was located under the gentle rays of the sun. One of my 3 escorts ran to report to headquarters. The other 2 stayed outside with me. They looked suspicious and worried, for they realized that they were now in the company of their superiors. Soon the first guard returned and picked me up and took me through the front door and reported me to the commander. Inside the CP, a number of officers and soldiers of the rear services were gathered around me. At first, I found such universal attention amusing, and I even laughed softly out loud. But soon came the realization of the gravity of my situation, which immediately washed the smile off my face. The battalion commander ordered the sergeant to search me. I was forced to strip down to my underwear. My pockets were searched again. Every corner of my clothing was examined. Two soldiers carefully ran their hands along the seams of my boots. They found nothing, of course, because I had already been stripped twice before. When everyone was satisfied with the results of the search, they grabbed my clothes and threw them back at me. The battalion commander came a few steps closer to me, slowly, to give me a chance to hastily pull my clothes on. As he approached, he asked in German, "Where are your papers?" I looked him in the eye and answered, "They have already been taken away by the company commander." The commander looked back at the leader of the escort group and asked, "Is this true?" He replied nervously, "Yes, comrade commander. We took them away. I must have given them to someone, or maybe I put them somewhere. I'll look for them." "Go look for them." The squad leader nodded and rushed out of the room. The battalion commander turned to me again. "Are you an officer?" "No, I'm a simple soldier, a cook. This was my first battle." He smiled and stepped back a few paces to his desk. Then he unfolded a piece of paper and placed it in front of me. It was a map of the entire area. It showed the Russian front line and the exact location of all the divisions down to the companies within them. "Are you familiar with the area?" "No, not familiar." He looked at the other officers behind me and said in Russian, "This swear word is fooling around. I don't have time for this. Take him to division headquarters." The guard grabbed my hand, with which I had just managed to button the last button, and took me to a small room where I was kept under guard for about 5 hours. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, another escort took me from my cell and led me out of the building. Two more soldiers were waiting outside. The division headquarters was located in another village, 20 kilometers deep into Russian Territory 30. I went there on foot, accompanied by 3 soldiers. We arrived at the place at 6 o'clock in the evening. One of them ran forward to warn the sentry at the gate of our arrival. Then we immediately followed to the office of the division commander. This officer was of the rank of colonel. One of the soldiers handed the commander a note. He silently read it, then looked at me and smiled. I wondered to myself whether the smile was caused by my appearance or by the content of the note. The commander walked over to me, peered into my face, and growled in a threatening tone, "You're going to have to start answering questions." That didn't scare me at all, but I realized that this was now much more serious than before. The colonel walked around me. I continued to stand still. He asked again and again, "Where are your papers?" I answered each time that someone in the company had taken them. This line of behavior seemed to work for me, and I decided to stick with it. All this went on for a few minutes. Then he turned away and shouted, "I'm sick of this. Lock him up." The 2 escorts stood beside me on either side and escorted me into a nearby building. When we got inside, they handed me over to a soldier who, I learned, was acting as the division's brig chief. He was sitting at a table in a room at the front of the building. Next to him were 3 women. I did not often come across women in the Russian army. I'm sure he was proud to be surrounded like that. There was another man there, a Russian civilian, who I later learned was the master of the house. The divisional prison chief got up from the table and approached me. He had only one question for me. "Do you send home parcels or stolen goods?" I did not expect such a question. I didn't answer it. Then a civilian stepped forward and asked me, "Didn't you, Krat, steal that fur coat?" What kind of questions were these? I did not answer this one either. "As you wish," the warder hissed. He unlocked the lock, opened a stout door that led into a dark room, and pushed me inside. Then quickly closed the door behind me. I looked around and found that I was in a cell with 5 other prisoners. All of them were Russian. 3 of them wore the German uniforms of Vlasov's army. The other 2 were civilians. They had formerly served in the Ukrainian police, and as it turned out, the Germans had forced them to serve by force. Everyone immediately recognized that I was a German soldier. They began to scrutinize me, but I didn't even look at them and went straight to the opposite corner of the cell. I stood there silently looking at the wall. The others were silent as well. How long would I hold out before they lost their patience? And more importantly, what would become of me when they did? Apparently, I had plenty of time to ponder these questions. It was October 30th. Before dark, we were all very tired, and we each laid down on the floor and fell asleep. We spent that night in the cold cell, huddled together to keep warm. I never said a word to anyone. At 7 a.m., we heard the key turn in the lock. The door creaked loudly and opened wide enough to let a ray of light into the darkness. Then it slammed shut quickly. An hour later, the door opened again, more slowly this time. It was the master of the house who came in, bringing breakfast, a pot of soup, 6 spoons, and 6 pieces of bread. A woman came in with him. The warder also entered the cell and loomed over us. Eat, he barked. I was in no mood to eat, so I refused to eat. Then he turned to me. Ah, this is too primitive for you. Then he looked at the woman and threw it down. This soldier wants to eat from his own plate. Bring it to him. The woman went out and immediately returned with a plate and a German spoon. I was the only one who was given a wooden spoon. I was not hungry, but I wanted to express my gratitude for such sensitivity to my German ancestry. Still sitting on the floor, I looked the warden in the eye and nodded my thanks. Then I took my plate and began to eat. He smiled and spoke. Culture is culture. With these words, the warden and the woman disappeared behind the door and locked it again.